After having recently completed Dark Souls 2 for the first time, and having played a good deal of it through in New Game Plus, I have to say, this game has some of the most horrendous boss encounters in any game I've ever completed, and I don't mean this in terms of the apparent difficulty of the bosses in the game. I've found several bosses in this game which I absolutely dread having to fight, usually due to a myriad of reasons, or bosses that I simply found either so lazy or uninspired that whenever I cross paths with them, I more often found myself thinking, why the hell did the developers even create this thing, than how should I go about defeating this thing? Now keep in mind, these thoughts and opinions are largely what had been going through my mind during my initial encounters with these bosses. Some of these have since changed, most of them haven't. If you disagree with me or don't find fault where I did, perhaps because you're a more veteran Souls player than myself, that's fine. This list is only detailing what I found to be the worst bosses, and shouldn't be taken as objective in the slightest. For some of you, your favorite bosses might be on this list. So, without further ado, here is my personal top 5 list of the absolute worst bosses in Dark Souls 2. Number 5. The Twin Dragon Slayers. This boss is the first you'll encounter in DawnLight Castle, but this isn't its first appearance. The melee-centered Dragon Rider is the boss of Hate's Tower of Flame, but for this encounter is joined by his brother in the blue trunks sniping at you from an elevated pedestal. So the first issue I have with it is obvious. It's just a lazy reuse of what is likely to be the second boss you'll encounter in the game, just beefed up with a second range-based variant to slap a little bit of added, and might I say wholly unnecessary, layer of difficulty to the boss. The second issue is the fact that, in addition to the massive sweeping attacks doled out by the red Dragon Rider, you'll have to dodge arrows from its blue doppelganger up top, and because of the audio cues from the bows aren't as obvious as they could be, you'll be constantly repositioning yourself and the boss in order to keep both riders in your line of sight. While I played a caster and this fight was made utterly trivial by the Great Lightning Bolt miracle, this boss still poses an annoyance to melee characters. Add on to that the fact that this is likely the developers intending to try and recreate the encounter of Ornstein and Smoke from the original Dark Souls, and you've got a balm of insult to smear on the injury. Number 4. The Executioners Cherian. If I were to factor in the run to this boss, and the blatant lack of foresight the developers had in their not placing a shortcut from the bonfire to the bridge that leads to this boss, the Executioner's Cherian would place much higher on this list, but then so would Velstadt, and he's not even on this list. With that out of the way, this boss is just a prime example of artificial difficulty, something that several bosses in Dark Souls 2 suffer from. The boss itself isn't that difficult and is fairly straightforward. You're led by the nose down a long corridor, presumably to do something to prevent the boss from running around the track endlessly. This mechanic isn't really a problem, and since it was deliberately designed this way, I can't really fault the encounter on the whole. However, the fact that this boss has only one largely viable way to fight it, supposing you aren't a ranged character, I find, is a massive oversight. But that's not where the artificial difficulty comes in. That's found in the nuisance skeletons and necromancers that pester you around the arena. These things don't add anything to the fight, they're just annoying. They were put there to add some sort of challenge to weaving in and out of small alcoves while you run down a long hallway to pull the gate and stop the chariot. Their only purpose is to chip away at your life and slow you down. Other bosses further down on this list suffer from the same problem. It's just a lazy way to try to make the boss challenging, and in the end, it only makes it frustrating. Number 3. The Royal Rat Authority. Speaking of artificial difficulty, the Royal Rat Authority could be seen as a much more annoying and less atmospheric Sif reprisal. Let's compare the two. Sif is a large, proud wolf who stands watch over his master's grave and his sword, using the weapon as a means of defending the grounds. Throughout the fight, which is challenging and engaging, Sif shows obvious signs of damage, which elicits sympathy from the player. As he grows weaker, he becomes more pathetic and, as a result, sympathetic. This fight was memorable for both its level of difficulty and the emotional weight behind the fight itself. The Royal Rat Authority is a large rat the size of Sif, which guards something. It's never explicitly stated what the Doors of Pharos are or why they're important. It has a set of irritating moves, one of which seems to just ignore hitboxes or dodging invincibility frames altogether, and comes complete with a pack of matching toxic rats, which, again, serve to be nuisances and distract the player from the monstrous rat. Unless you're a ranged character, and even then it's unlikely, you won't be able to kill these smaller rats before the Authority jumps into combat, almost guaranteed, so you'll be dealing with scurrying little blighters nipping at your ankles while trying to dodge the incessant lunging of their larger counterpart. This fight the fight wasn't that difficult as a caster, personally, but I can see how this fight is an absolute nightmare for melee characters. Not to mention that this is one of the only non-humanoid bosses in the game, and it's only just as boring as the former. I have no idea how the same developers who made this could create this mess. Such disappointment. Number 2. The Prowling Mages and Congregation. Okay, Look, I'm sure that designing the bosses for the Souls games isn't an easy feat. There's having to come up with a unique idea, mechanics, movesets, appearance, and balancing. I get that. But seriously? This is the best you can come up with? The Prowling Mages and Congregation is the easiest fight in the game. No, the entire Souls series, bar none. It's just a set of 3 casters hurling hexes and lightning bolts at you, while the same mindless undead you've been fighting for hours stupidly shuffle toward you in a small chapel. That's it. I'd like to compare this fight to the Fool's Idol fight from Demon Souls, because they're similar on some levels. In that fight, you had to kill the Reanimator who would constantly resurrect the Fool's Idol every time you killed it ad infinitum. While the fight wasn't difficult, this mechanic at least made it so the players had to think a little bit. Here, there's just no point. You could run in with AoE Pyromancy spell and kill the boss in 2 hits, hell, maybe even 1. This fight is just abysmal and has no right to exist in a series where this is the norm. And my number 1 worst boss in Dark Souls 2 is the Duke's Dear Freya. This might come as a surprise to some and might not make too many friends, but I honestly have a deep-seated personal hatred for this boss. Honestly, I nearly quit playing altogether because of it. The Duke's Dear Freya, in concept, is not a very challenging fight. There's a large spider in a room with smaller spiders, which are only weak at 2 points. Okay, so it's reasonably challenging, but what makes this boss unforgivable for me is one thing, one minor thing, that will get you killed over and over and over again if you don't know about it. Run between the legs. If you don't know to run between the legs, this boss is nigh on impossible. Let me explain. Freya has 2 heads. Periodically, throughout the fight, the head that is currently facing you will fire a giant frickin' laser beam, because spiders can do that now, I guess, which will shave off about 1/3 of your health if you get hit by it. And it does this constantly. You can't dodge through the beam, or at least from what I've tried, and outrunning it can be a challenge. Your best bet is to try and run through the legs to reach the other head. And if you don't know that that's the effective dead zone of the laser, you're just going to be fodder for it every single time. Unfortunately, this is the catalyst from which the other reasons I hate this boss draw strength. It has nuisance adds that, unlike other bosses on this list, will actually respawn, only 2 weak points, those being the heads, and, perhaps worst of all, those heads can fall off. I haven't personally seen this happen, but I've read that it is possible for both of the heads to fall off, and for the boss to remain alive. If this is possible, it makes this boss one of the worst in all of the Souls games for effectively making the boss totally invincible if that condition is met. Still, having even one head fall off just makes the boss more of a pain to deal with, and for all these reasons, the Duke's Dear Freya is my number 1 worst boss in Dark Souls 2. So what are your worst bosses in Dark Souls 2? Are they actually as bad as mine? Are they better than mine? Are they even mine? I don't know. Leave a comment down below if you have an opinion, because I like listening to your opinions, guys. And, be ready for the next countdown. I might just put best bosses of Dark Souls 2, so have a good one!